Welcome to episode 50 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm going to be interviewing T.A. Snyder. T.A. was a winner in the 2014 Screencraft Fellowship, and he talks about how that's helped him advance his career. So stay tuned for that. This episode is sponsored by Screencraft.org. In the interview, we will talk about TA's experience winning the Screencraft Fellowship last year. It really has helped TA get his career to the next level, which you'll hear more about in the interview. The final deadline for this year's fellowship program is Monday, December 15th. So if you want to sign up, now is the time. Just go to screencraft.org/fellowship. I will link to that in the show notes too. Couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mentioned in the podcast can be found on the blog in the show notes. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode number 50. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm talking with writer and Screencraft Fellowship winner T.A. Snyder. Here is the interview. Welcome, T.A., to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So to start out, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you got started as a screenwriter.
I started writing my first scripts when I was around 16, 17. I knew at that point I was going to go to film school. I grew up in a little small town in central southern Illinois, grew up most of my life out in the country, and my only connection to like the world was a satellite dish that we had. And I watched a lot of movies growing up at probably an inappropriate age. I was watching like Aliens and Terminator at like age 6. And it just got in my head then. And I always told my folks I wanted to be an architect for the longest time, which kind of baffled them. You know, I'd sit and draw like houses, and then I started drawing like little characters and things, and then I got into like reading a lot, and I just started connecting the written angle with the, visual. And I knew pretty early on I wanted to go to film school. I never had a video camera growing up, anything like that. I didn't touch a camera until I got to Columbia in Chicago when I was 18.
Okay, and so that was sort of your first foray into actually writing some scripts and getting into filmmaking, was going to college?
Yeah, definitely. I had the things in my head. I wrote a lot of stuff, but I went in thinking, okay, I'm gonna be a screenwriter. I'm gonna study screenwriting. I'm gonna get a degree in screenwriting. And I got some great advice from an advisor who said, look, you either have the discipline to do screenwriting or not. Take a few classes, but take directing, take acting, take editing. Take all these other elements that go into making a movie, and that will only make you a better writer. And he was so right. I always thank that guy for giving me that advice.
Yeah. Okay, so now you've gone to college, you've gotten your degree. What is sort of your steps once you get out of college to actually accomplishing this career goal?
Well, I bounced around a lot because I got the bug to actually, do the independent side of things, of like doing movies my way, shooting. I would shoot, I would edit. Soderbergh was my guy for a long time. I'm going to shoot it, I'm going to edit it, I'm going to direct it, I'm going to do everything. And I found a really cool team of guys in Chicago who were out of the Blue Man Group. A lot of them either acted or did crew work at Blue Man. And we bounced around for many, many years doing little indie films, music videos. We did a YouTube show for a while. I basically couldn't say no. If anyone offered, like, hey, you want to come shoot this or you want to edit this, I said yes. And as a result of it, I didn't write for many years because I really got into the production side of things. And then about 3 years ago, I refocused on screenwriting. I had some things go on, like medically with my health, to where I kind of had to focus on writing because I was kind of bedridden for a couple months. And it was kind of, I fell back in love with the written word. And the scripts I wrote coming out of that are then what started doing well in contests and eventually led to me getting a rep.
So now, during this period of time where you're editing and directing these films, can you maybe talk about what were you doing with them? Were you seeing some, even minor success? Were you entering those in contests, YouTube channel? Were you doing features, shorts? What were you working on mostly, and how was it going?
Yeah, the first one we did was with the Blue Man guys, and that's a crazy story because I actually grew up in the same small town with the two guys that I wrote and directed it with. But we weren't close growing up in this little town. I moved to Chicago, went to school, graduated, was in Chicago for 5 years before I finally reached out to them and realized, oh my God, I'm living in an apartment around the corner from the Blue Man Group. And my mom mentioned, hey, do you know that Tom and Adam work at Blue Man Group right around the corner? I was like, no, I didn't realize that. I'll give, do you have their phone number? I'll give them a call. And we got together for lunch, and they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm working on the script. Like, hey, we've got a little bit of money. You want to shoot it? I was like, yeah, let's do that. And it took us about 1.5 years to shoot and edit it. This was right before YouTube. So we were shooting it on DVX cameras, and then we hit the festival circuit.
And this was a feature? It was a feature film or a short?
This was a feature called Troubadours. We took it all the way down to Texas to like Austin. We played in like some places in Missouri, Southern Illinois, and Facets, this small distribution company in Chicago, ended up releasing it. They got it like on Netflix. So it was, we didn't make any money off of it, but it was a hell of an experience.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so now you've I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, so now you've gotten sort of some success. You've kind of gotten off the ground, and let's talk about now sort of moving forward. So you're laid up in bed for a few months. You start writing scripts, and what's sort of your next step as you finish some of these scripts? What do you start to do with them?
Well, I had these scripts that there was one in particular that had haunted me for a long time. In my mid-20s, I had to take a gig bartending for a while, and this old guy told me this crazy story about the first serial killers in America, and he claimed he was a descendant. And I was like, well, okay. And I started doing some research, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. The first serial killers, this was circa 1798, 1799 Kentucky, when like the Mississippi River was the West. That was the western boundary. I'm like, that's kind of interesting. Usually Westerns take place in the desert. This will be in like the caves and jungles of Kentucky and Southern Illinois. Maybe there's something here. And it just haunted me for a long time. I mean, years and years went by. And my father was in the military. His whole life he was in the Air Force and did multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, all throughout the War on Terror. And I was very ambivalent about, I had emotions on both sides of the coin as far as what he went through and what a lot of people went through during the War on Terror. And I started to realize, wow, the hunt for these first serial killers, they were kind of like the Osama bin Laden of their time. And John Adams put together this list, like this hit list that was like the first terrorists in America. And I started seeing all these parallels and a way to, connect that time to now and kind of obliquely put my emotions about, the War on Terror into the script. And that sort of emotional resonance came through, and that was the script that won the fellowship for Screencraft. And those guys, when they flew me out here in the May of 2014, I did a whole week of meetings, and it was blast off at that point. I mean, I was off and running.
So yeah, let's dig into the Screencraft fellowship. So first, I'm curious, how did you hear about Screencraft to even go ahead and submit to it? I'm
fairly certain it was either Facebook or Twitter. I had recently got onto Twitter. I mean, I'd had an account for a while, but I just would, occasionally check in. And I heard about it like a week or two before the deadline and kind of quickly, glanced over Deadman. And I had already had some mild success in I'd made the finals of the American Zoetrope contest with that script. So I had gotten great notes from them and done a couple of different passes since that. So it was a pretty locked in 4th or 5th draft by the time I submitted it to Screencraft.
Okay, so let's talk about that sort of moment of when you won. How did you find out that you were a winner of the Screencraft Fellowship? John
Rhodes called me and just laid it on me. He was like, hey, we're not going to make the official announcement for a couple of days. So, if you can, stay off social media. And it's just like, oh, my God. You just want to scream like, yes, I won.
Yeah. And maybe you can tell us, like, maybe you can describe sort of the emotions you had. And then even more importantly, what were your expectations now that you had been a winner of this?
I mean, my reaction to John on the phone, I think he probably was like, is this guy even excited? Because I was kind of speechless. But it really emotionally, I was in a very sensitive state at that point. I had a surgery the surgery was a success, but I got an infection and ended up in a hospital bed for 6 weeks, lost like 45 pounds. I mean, it got really scary. And I was just starting to recover from that, and couldn't lift anything over 5 pounds, and was just going to be basically, confined to a desk for a couple months. So his call came at just the most ideal moment of like, all this stuff you're going through, don't worry about it. Good things are coming. So it hit me emotionally.
Yeah, that's great.
And so they were great that, even before bringing me out to LA, they invited me to go to the WGA, awards in New York, in February, the end of February. So that was an eye-opener. I'd never been in New York. So I met those guys and went to the event and saw people like Richard Linklater and all sorts of cool people. It's like, wow, okay. It can change that quick.
Yeah. So once you won, maybe you can start to tell us sort of what exactly the fellowship entails and what you got, specifically what you got out of it. They fly you out to LA, and what is that week like?
Well, I mean, they give you a little bit of money. You get the trip, but much more than that, it's about putting you in the channels of, decision makers, managers, agents, producers. They gave us an itinerary ahead of time of, you're going to have about 2 meetings a day. Well, they kept adding to that. We ended up having 3, 4 sometimes a day. And of course, the first meeting you have, the first day, you're very nervous. But by the end of the week, you're just like, yeah, man, I'm ready. Let's do this. You wish you could go back and do that first meeting again, because you feel so seasoned by the end of the week of just nonstop, getting comfortable in a room. And that's what's so great about that fellowship that they do, because, I made the finals of the American Zoetrope, and, I got a call from Michael Zakin, who's producer for Sofia Coppola. And he's like, hey, Francis won, he read the finalists, and we were really close to picking yours, and, here's some notes, and, a little, that was cool, but that's what happens in a lot of contests. You'll get a little bit of money, you'll get a phone call, you'll get some notes, and that's the end of it. But with Screencraft, especially with the fellowship, it's very hands-on. Like they get you out here and they get you going with the whole thing.
So specifically, who were some of these meetings with? Agents, managers, producers. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
The first meeting, the first day, was with Kaplan Perone, a management company. We also met with other places like 3 Arts. One of the other fellows signed with Anonymous Content, and then eventually signed with an agent at Paradigm. We met at smaller little boutique production places like Treehouse Pictures. I went to Resolution, which Resolution has since closed its doors, but one of the agents I met there, I really had a rapport with, and when he left Resolution, I followed him and signed with him.
Okay, great. So maybe you can talk just a little bit about the specifics of these meetings. What did you actually talk about? Were you talking about you're pitching them your own writing projects, or did they have projects that, you might have been able to come on and write on? Maybe you can sort of describe what entails one of these meetings.
A lot of those initial meetings you get, you're mostly pitching yourself. I mean, you're pitching your projects, and sometimes they've read them and sometimes they haven't. So you need to have the long and the short version ready. I mean, if they haven't read it, you need to have a really short, quick pitch. And if they like it, they'll ask more questions. And I think they're just generally trying to get a feel for your voice. If they've read your script, they're like Kaplan Perone, a few others had read Deadman, the one that won, and we were able to really talk in depth regarding the story and the characters. And the Kaplan Perone meeting actually in the midst of it, we really talked a lot about Deadman, and I was like, actually, I initially wanted to make it a series, at least a limited, like, anthology series. But I kind of stepped back from that because I felt like I should get my arms around it first as a spec, and keep all that other stuff in the background. Because that was, when I first started writing Deadman, that was before American Horror Stories, before True Detective. It was before there was this precedent for, like, these types of shows doing an anthology thing like that. And they're like, that's great, you should do that. And I've always wanted to write for TV. I just hadn't written a pilot yet. So when I flew back to Illinois after that week of meetings, I sat down to write Deadman as a pilot and then a series Bible. So I've now got that in my portfolio to take out and not just get, spec work or feature work.
Yeah. No, it definitely sounds like, True Detective set in whatever you said, 1798. So it definitely, you can see how that was, because could be an infinite number of serial killers you could go after each season or each episode or whatever it is. So I wonder if you have any tips. You kind of gave us a little window into some of the ideas, the short version and the long version of your pitch, but maybe you can give us some tips and kind of tell us if you're someone that is maybe won the fellowship and is getting ready for these meetings, or if you're just having general meetings in general, maybe you have some tips for people that are going into these types of things.
Don't try to have a formula of like, you definitely want to practice your pitches, practice what you're going to say, but be open to the person sitting in front of you and, make a personal connection. And above all else, sell yourself as well. And it's delicate. You don't want to come off too much like a salesman, but you definitely need to let them know why you are the unique, right voice to tell this story better than anyone else.
And what would be like maybe you could give us like a specific example of something you said that was sort of selling yourself as opposed to just selling the story.
Well, for example, I had some success then at the same exact time that they told me in January that I'd won the fellowship, but it wasn't until May that they flew me out. And in that window of time, I had finished a script called The Volunteer. And it's a World War II Holocaust movie, but it's got a unique hook in that it's a true story of the only spy known to have purposely volunteered to get captured and taken into Auschwitz. And his mission was to lead an uprising and break everyone out. And it begins as a spy movie and becomes a prison break movie. I mean, clearly everyone knows he didn't succeed, but he does succeed in, breaking himself out and a few of his friends. And I was like, I'm a young guy, I'm a history hound, but what do I know about that? It kind of felt like, am I at a mature enough place in my life to really write that? And I probably wasn't going to finish the script, but when I went in for that surgery and then started losing all the weight and I got in this really dark, scared area. And I asked my mom and dad to bring in my folder of all the research I had. And I wrote most of the first draft for that script from my hospital bed. And it shows. I mean, it's really, I felt a frequency with that character. And I would tell that story when pitching that script, and, it's connecting my personal, emotions with this guy's journey. I'd never compare myself to an Auschwitz survivor, and, this guy was a total hero, but being able to talk on an emotional level about something traumatic, it informs what you're writing about.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great tip, and a heartwarming story. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you actually got your manager. You kind of talked about it briefly a minute ago, but maybe you can dig into some specifics about how all that went down.
Well, it was interesting. Let's see, what's the best way to tell this? I met Jeff through Screencraft. They took all three of us to Resolution. And Jeff sat down with us and gave us just general advice. He talked for an hour. He hadn't read any of our scripts, and he wasn't planning to. He just, here's a bunch of advice, and it was great. I was like, wow, this guy's, he really shot us straight, told us exactly what it's like, and, thanks for the meeting. And then near the end of the week, I got a call from Scott Carr, this rep, who had found The Volunteer through the blacklist. And He was like, I'd like to talk with you about this. I'm like, well, serendipitous timing, man, because I'm in LA right now. He's like, oh, well, let's meet. We went and had lunch, and then that night he invited me to this little black book party in Beverly Hills, like your cliched, like pool rooftop party. And as I'm there, I see Jeff from Resolution, and he walks over and he's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, this guy Scott invited me. And he's like, oh, okay, interesting. Pitch me some of your stuff. And I proceeded to pitch him Dead Men and Volunteer, and he's like, okay, I want to read those. Send them over. And so he read them. I flew back to Illinois the next day, and he quickly read them. Scott was also looking at it. I had some other people looking at it, and I just I don't know, I like Jeff a lot. We seem to be on the same page in regards to what I'm writing now and what I want to expand into. And then we kind of had the misfortune of, Resolution closing their doors, but he had planned for that and started a company called Heretic, and I followed him there.
Okay, great. So maybe you can talk a little bit about now that you have representation, how that sort of affected your career and what I guess Jeff has been able to do for you.
Well, it's very new. I just moved to LA just going on 2 months ago.
Okay.
And our kind of strategy is Dead Men and The Volunteer are both, they're strong writing samples. If the right director or the right actor attached, we could be off and running. But they're both technically period pieces, and you're immediately going to get a closed door at half the places you go out to with that. They're just going to not, you're going to say, we're not doing those type of movies. So we want to go out first with the most commercial piece that I've got, which is a contemporary thriller that I want to do another pass on first. So we're kind of in a holding pattern until I get that to where it needs to be. That way we can, go out wide with that first, and then they can say, what else you got? And I've got these two other completely different projects ready.
Yeah.
I also lined up a book adaptation gig that I'm going to sign the contract on this coming week. And that's going to pay me enough upfront money to just write for a while. So I'll be adapting that book. It's a true story. And The Volunteer is what kind of locked the gig for me, seeing that I had taken a guy's real life and, made it into this, powerful 2-hour spec.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a minute. So how did you get that gig? And it's you're taking someone's novel and you're converting it into a screenplay, correct?
Well, it's actually his personal life. It's his true story. This guy's now kind of become like a motivational speaker and does like TED Talks and stuff like that. Broadly, his story, it's kind of like Rocky meets skydiving. And I didn't even know there's a competitive skydiving sport. But this guy was kind of a blue-collar guy from the Midwest, and he had an opportunity to go to the East Coast and work with these guys who were the preeminent skydiving guys who were going to like represent America in the World Cup. And he decided to go off on his own, stopped in Arizona and started this ragtag group of guys, and they like lived out of their vans and quickly built up to where they were competing to win the U.S. Nationals. And just when it looked like they were going to win and represent America, they were in a plane crash that killed the majority of the people on board the plane, including a lot of his best friends and teammates. And he broke his back. They told him, he was in a coma for a couple months. And they told him, look, you'll be lucky to walk again, and you'll certainly never skydive again. Well, 6 months later, he was not only jumping out of planes, but he went on to win the world championship. So he's just this incredible. I went and met him in person at his skydiving school down in Paris by San Diego, and we kind of just hit it off. I mean, I'd recently come through, my trials with medical, issues, and we kind of connected on music and all different types of things. So he liked the take that I had on it, and we're gonna go forward.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get like sort of the initial lead? Like how did you find him initially to even meet with him in his skydiving school? Well,
it's kind of crazy. That's actually from a producer I met at a place called Cinestory, and it's once a year. It's a retreat up in Idlewild, and they invite 25 writers. It's a contest, and then once they whittle it down to the final scripts, they invite the writers to come to this retreat in Idlewild, and you spend a week with one-on-one meetings with directors, producers, writers, just hammering out notes and going over your scripts. And then they put you like in the room with everyone watching you, and you have to pitch your movie in 5 minutes. And then after you're done pitching, you sit down and they evaluate your pitch as though they're real, executives, and as though you're not in the room. So that was extremely helpful to go through that. And by the end of the week, you're just like, okay, this is how it works, And I met this producer there. She was the first. You get 3 different one-on-one mentors, and she was my first. And she had told me then, I want to find something we can work on. And, it was great to hear, but she followed through on it. She called me like 3 weeks later and said, here's this book, read it. If you connect with it, we'll take you out and you can pitch.
Great. That's a great story. So let's talk about, you mentioned, I guess it's called SynQuest, a couple of these other contests you've entered. Maybe you can kind of speak to that. Over the years, how many contests have you entered, and how did you fare in some of them? And maybe you can talk about some of your successes and even some of your failures.
Going back to 2012, the winter of 2012, I believe, was when the Blacklist launched. The online one where you could submit your scripts, because before it had kind of been just only people in the industry would nominate these scripts, and the list would go out. It was just the favorite scripts that hadn't been produced yet. And so they opened that up in the winter of 2012, and I put Deadman, an early draft of Deadman, on there. And if you score an 8 or higher, your log line gets blasted out to people. And I was lucky enough to get, several 8s and 9s, and was on the first quarter of the top 5 scripts, downloaded scripts. I was like number 3 on there. So that was really great, and, got me talking with some people and working on things. And then I kind of got the bug, I kept entering it into, you name it. I was putting up the money and putting in Fresh Voices or Blue Cat, or you name it, Austin, Scriptapalooza, and a lot of them, that script made it to the quarterfinals, the semifinals, but never a real big breakthrough until American Zoetrope. I made the finals of that, which as a big movie geek, their big selling point is that the final 10 scripts are read by Francis Ford Coppola. It's like, oh my God, this legend is reading your script. So that that was cool to get some heat off of that, just a little bit, but it didn't really go anywhere. And it wasn't until Screencraft that I actually got out to LA and started having meetings. Austin was cool too, because Austin has the film festival wrapped in with it, and I mean, it's just mecca for writers. It's just a week of nonstop. And Vince Gilligan was there that year, and a lot of these heroes of mine, Jonathan Demme, and it was amazing.
Did you place in the Austin Film Festival contest, or you just entered it?
I had made the second round, which gets you a discount on the badge.
Okay.
And then I met a guy down there that had made the semifinals, and to me, it's more about getting out there and networking with people.
And
that's kind of the problem with some of these, lower level contests. It's like, okay, you can get some bragging rights, but really, what are you getting out of it? If you're not getting out and connecting with other writers or producers or people making movies, then what are you really doing? It's just a popularity contest at that point, and you're just hoping that someone, because it's so subjective, everyone's going to read a script a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I'm curious just to get your thoughts on that sort of subjectivity of these contests. I mean, obviously the script, I mean, to get 8 and 9s on the Blacklist, I mean, clearly you're on to something. Other contests, you don't place at all. Other contests, your quarterfinals, semifinals. I mean, maybe you can speak to that, because that's another thing I get from writers. They enter 1 or 2 contests and they don't place at all, and they kind of feel like, oh, well, that means maybe the script isn't good, or they enter the blacklist and it means the script isn't good. And clearly here you have the script, and obviously it's slightly different versions, but there must have been, instances where you submitted the same version to one contest and got crickets, and submitted that same script to another contest and made, some fairly significant progress. So maybe you can just speak to, how you deal with that, where it feels very, not only does it feel subjective, it feels almost random at times.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we all want the validation. I mean, we write to connect, It's difficult to be told you're not good enough, but that's part of the industry. I mean, if you can't develop somewhat of a thick skin and be constructive and collaborating and being able to take notes and listen and actually execute them, you're going to have a hard time in this business. I think that's a good way. The minor leagues of the contest, it can help you kind of develop that thick skin and, not be so sensitive about things, especially the ones that give you notes, especially the hard-hitting notes. The blacklist is great about that. They'll just wallop you with stuff that's like, oh, that's harsh. But you need to hear that sometimes. And Deadman, I knew Deadman was probably going to maybe break through because it kept making semifinals or, quarterfinals. And I'd been warned ahead of time, like, it's people wanted to dismiss it as just a Western. And I'm like, it's not a Western. It predates Westerns by 60 years. It's more like Game of Thrones and blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, whatever, good luck. And, it broke through. Volunteer, it's a really tough read. And it took a while for it to really break through. It made the semifinals with the nickel, and it made the finals with Cage. And just making the semifinals with the nickel was huge. I had like a dozen emails and calls. I didn't even have to query anybody. They just reached out to me, which kind of blew my mind. Of wow, I only made this, the semifinals. I didn't realize, I knew it was prestigious, but I didn't realize it was such a feeding frenzy around the semifinals. I figured you had to at least make the finals to get any sort of heat on you.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. Semifinal round does that. I'm curious if there's anything else. So you talk about all the contests you've entered and a little bit about the blacklist. Have there been any other things that you've tried to move your screenwriting career forward? And maybe they just haven't worked, and so you kind of haven't continued. But maybe there's some other things out there that you've tried or even thought maybe you should have tried.
Well, I definitely tried the going the indie route. Writing these small movies and, making them myself. And I think there's a lot to that, especially if you're young, you can really get away with spending years doing that, getting your hands on a camera, getting in the editing room. I can't stress enough how important it is to get in an editing room. And if you can learn editing, do some yourself. Work on documentaries, work on little YouTube shows and shoot stuff and get the rhythm of a movie, of a narrative in your bones, really learn how to put a movie together. And that's only going to make you a tighter, sharper writer. I don't really have anything to show for it. It was almost my entirety of my 20s I spent, doing the indie thing, making those little shorts and music videos and indie features. But I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Because it really informed my writing in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. So I wonder, what's the best way for people to keep up with you? Maybe you can mention your Twitter handle. If you have a blog, you can mention that. Really anything, any way that people could contact you or just follow along with what you're doing.
The best way to get a hold of me is Twitter. I'm at Captain Haystack, all one word together.
Okay, I'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay, yeah, that was the handle I had on Troubadours, my first movie I directed. An actor would call me Captain Haystack, so it's kind of just stuck.
Perfect.
But I'm happy to answer questions. I've had a lot of people reach out to me regarding the Screencraft Fellowship.
Okay.
So I'm happy to talk with people about that.
Sure. So, well, T.A., you've been very generous with your time. This has been a great interview. I wish you luck, and it sounds like you're well on your way. So maybe you can check back with me in 6 months or a year and give us an update.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks, Ashley.
In the next episode of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Matt Creed. Matt is a writer and director of an indie film that's coming out in the next couple of weeks called Lily. It's a really nice little film. It's a true art house type of film that I know a lot of writers are trying to write. He does a really good job handling a very subtle story. So if you're trying to write this sort of small Sundance type of art film, you're not going to want to miss this episode. So keep an eye out for that next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with TA. Recently, I had a number of people on the podcast who got their start by going out and making independent films, which is what TA did, although it didn't seem to propel his career to the next level. But now he started to find success through Screencraft and some of these other contests. That's part of what I preach on this podcast. All things aren't going to work for all people, and it's not always quite clear why. As I mentioned before, for whatever reason, most of my own success has come from my own email and fax blast service. I've certainly tried other services like the Blacklist and Inktip. I've certainly entered some contests, but for whatever reason, those just never quite worked for me. So as someone who's trying to get their first foothold, you really need to be exploring the various channels that are available to you to market your scripts and pushing on all of them. And then as you see some success with one of them, you push hard in that direction. I think it's interesting, too, to note that TA got his current manager by winning the Screencraft Fellowship and by also placing highly on the Blacklist. It wasn't one or the other. It was a combination of the two. He got invited to the party because he met someone through the Blacklist, and then he knew someone at the party because he had met them previously through one of the meetings that Screencraft set up for him. This is exactly how networking works. It's not always an immediate connection where you hit it off with someone and they become your manager. Sometimes it takes 2 or even 3 random meetings with someone before something actually clicks. Once again, I just want to mention that the final deadline for next year's fellowship with Screencraft is Monday, December 15th. So if you want to sign up, now is the time. I will link to it in the show notes. Again, it's screencraft.org/fellowship. Again, just when you go, if you want to look at it in the show notes, just find sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast and then look for episode number 50. Over the last couple of months, I've gotten to know John Rhodes a bit. He's the co-founder of Screencraft. I had him on back in episode 19, so go have a listen to that one if you haven't already listened to it. He's a real hustler. He's a great networker, and I can tell you his primary focus right now is to make sure the winners of his contest get noticed and to help them launch their careers. It really is a great opportunity for writers, so if you've got a good script, I highly suggest you enter it in this contest and give it a go. If you do enter, good luck to you. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.